Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Oops!
Welcome back to the Megatronic Legacy writing series by the Obscure Titan. We now take a look at our 37th President of the United States of America. Shocking, I know. While President Reagan and Senator Biden will get their roles in the series, Richard Nixon is going to have the most screen time out of all the historical and political figures. Why? Well, I mentioned his interactions with Buzz in his own episode of the Writing Saga. I intend to give my take on Nixon in a more empathetic light. But don't worry, he's still a crook. I won't go super detailed on his presidency, but just enough to use for my conceptions in the Nibiru Crisis and the Cold War Spyro Trilogy. Now let's get this investigation started. His presidency, I mean. Born in California in 1919, Nixon was known to have such a brilliant record at both Whittier College and Duke University Law School prior to beginning his practice of law. 1940 commences, and he's married to Patricia Ryan. He served as a Navy lieutenant commander in the Pacific during World War II, though the siege in the Pacific had already passed despite thinking he could go into battle. Leaving the service, Nixon was elected to Congress from his California district, winning his Senate seat in 1950. He ends up being General Eisenhower's running mate for the 1952 election. In 1960, Nixon ran against Democratic John F. Kennedy and lost at a narrow margin. However, he ran in 1968 and was able to narrowly defeat Democratic Herbert Humphrey and third party George Wallace. Accomplishments are, but not limited to, revenue sharing, ending of the draft, new anti-crime laws, and a broad environmental program. Sounds like an environmentally friendly conservative, if you ask me. One of his most acclaimed accomplishments throughout his presidency is his quest for world stability. He reduced tensions with Communist China and the USSR by making visits to Beijing and Moscow. His summit meetings with Russian leader Leonid Brezhnev opened doors to a treaty to limit nuclear weapons, among others to only name a few. Nixon won a landslide re-election against Democratic George McGovern in 1972. However, just within a few months, the Nixon administration was under fire over the Watergate scandal, stemming from a break-in at Democratic National Committee offices in the 1972 campaign. The break-in was traced to officials to secure Nixon's re-election. Vice President Spyro T. Agnew resigned in 1973 in response to unrelated scandals in Maryland. This got Nixon to nominate Gerald Ford as his VP. In the midst of potential impeachment, Nixon decided to announce his resignation on August 8, 1974. In his resignation address, he plans to leave office to begin the process of healing which is so desperately needed in America. In his final years, Nixon would occasionally appear on television in response to the Reagan administration and the tensions with the USSR. He's also made interviews with select interviewers to reflect on his personal life. Nixon passes away on April 22, 1994. Despite his Watergate incident souring the GOP, he wrote numerous books to reflect his experiences in public life as well as foreign policy. I already discussed Nixon's part in the progressive fallout in my Buzz Lightyear episode. Instead, I'll delve into the post-Nibiru Crisis storyline, whether it be in comic form or what. I plan to utilize his presidency that leads to his role in 1984's Dark Redemption. It's been more than 7 years since Duncan Carterson vanished into Nibiru and then Mystica. President Nixon is determined to get his friend back at any cost, even if he secretly takes money from public services to do so.
Well, I'm not a crook.
President Nixon uses the money to build his own resources to get to space, wrapping up enough to boost numbers for the Space Ranger program. In this continuity, I had some ideas to have the Space Ranger program open under the Eisenhower administration. Technically, this would start during FDR's fourth term, however, through Truman and Eisenhower invest their money to flourish the program. Cold War tensions could have the Space Ranger program to race against the Soviet Union's attempts to land on the moon. This was also during a time when rockets taking off into space was always a life or death situation, and would take trial before even attempting to achieve their goal. Each Space Ranger would be equipped with laser gauntlets, wings, and metal swords. This would give America an edge over the USSR's military might from the 1950s to 1970s. But why haven't they enacted on it? Well, the Johnson administration's one of the reasons why the program's been stagnated. Another is the investment was getting too much, that even far-left Democratic politicians agree with the conservative debate that it's become too costly. Duncan Carterson's disappearance was difficult enough to handle, and allowing more of their American people to suffer the same fate would paint a bad image to the free country. But Nixon was determined to rescue his friend, even if it crossed his conservative boundaries. The 37th president spent a good chunk of his time as president to take spending from some programs in order to ramp up the Space Ranger program. But this would accelerate inflation. The condition of America's federal spending would become worse here than in our current timeline, as the Space Ranger program is getting more money. But even that could cause issues with those working in it. More people leave the Space Ranger program, and attempts to take off into space decreased, essentially not even having a single test to do so. Nixon grew frustrated with all this, but following his 1972 re-election, people began to question the president's ulterior motives. Why has he put up so much money into the Space Ranger program where he could have used it to fight off stagflation? And yes, that's what it was called at the time. Flan, in the midst of the chaos, tried getting to talk to President Nixon to find out what his motives were, and after looking deeper to his corrupt crusade, she calls him out in a private conversation and points out the issues needed to be dealt with. President Nixon lashes out at Flan, calling her a traitor to America, which sparks her memories of leaving America back in 1917. But she persisted to call him out for lying to the people in the friendship with Buzz. Instead of continuing the fight, Nixon left Flan and kept drinking alcohol to find ease in the chaos. But it didn't help as it continued. But as more news discussed potential impeachment for Nixon's attempts to abuse his power, on top of being mounted by his failed attempts to rescue Buzz, he announces his resignation and left office. It soured America so badly that Nixon severed his ties with Flan entirely. At the beginning of former President Nixon's resignation, he fled with his family and not a word was said since then. Despite Flan's best efforts to reconcile with the former president, he would not budge to forgive her and those who tried to stop him. He spent almost a decade in isolation with his wife. Looking back at his efforts in making the Space Ranger program more proficient, Nixon abused the spending system of America to make it work. But the worst thing was his thoughts about Duncan Carterson's disappearance in space. Nixon kept thinking about his best friend who was sent by late President Kennedy into space. The more Nixon thought about it, the more resentful he became to himself. He wouldn't forgive himself for his own transgressions. Approaching 1983's Norcarchy, Richard Nixon makes his occasional appearances. He receives calls from President Reagan and his private meetings with him. The president remarks Nixon's resentment regarding Flan and his distrust of Spyro. Nixon would occasionally comment at Spyro and Flan's mission to prevent a crystalline detonation by Nasty Nork, suggesting they couldn't have the power to stop it, even if they wanted to. But following Spyro's success in preventing Nasty's crystal bomb, Nixon becomes impressed and congratulates him. As 1984 rolls around, the former president becomes less resentful and more willing to believe in Spyro and Flan's dedication to America's security. During the events of Awakening of Godzilla, Nixon was growing to care for Spyro, Flan, and Conker in their fight to prevent the King of the Monsters from invading America. But realizing they're trapped in the Genie Realm, Nixon takes it upon himself to become a Space Ranger himself and rescue them. Going into 1984's Dark Redemption, Etna's fleet invades the depowered Genie Realm. But as the chaos ensues with a portal, Richard Nixon's ship clashes with the Misilican fleet and all crash into Mystica. Nixon makes his way out of his spaceship to see the Dark Realm of the Nexus Pillar and is determined to save Spyro's crew. The surprise he didn't expect was finding his old friend, Duncan Carterson, also known as Buzz Lightyear. Nixon and Buzz have a happy reunion, but for a moment. They both agreed to find Spyro's crew, who winded up being in Mystica, and return to America safely. But as the story progresses, Nixon's age and condition has made him a slightly easier target for Misilica's militia to take down. Buzz constantly watches over his friend and does everything in his power to ensure former President Nixon is kept alive. Nixon grows to realize his mistakes that impacted his home country and admits to them. He clearly has a heart, but often gets clouded by his insecurities. This causes Nixon to cower back in his alcoholism and resentment he's been having for so long, and Buzz's disappearance may have exacerbated his condition. As soon as Misilica got a hold of Light and Dark Energon weed, she proceeds to kill Nixon, only for Buzz to push him out of the way and got violently beaten instead. I talked about this in my Buzz Lightyear video, but suffice it to say, this devastated Nixon greatly. Buzz's legs and chest were crushed, and Spyro's crew came in to help. Once this was all over and Misilica defeated, Buzz was sent to the hospital and President Reagan comforted Nixon in this near-death experience his friend went through. Richard Nixon was born in California in 1919, having such a brilliant intellect at both Whittier College and Duke University. He studied law and practiced it throughout his lifetime. But throughout his time in World War II in politics, Nixon met a few people that would change his life forever. Duncan Carterson has been his friend throughout World War II, and grew further in the political landscape in the late 1950s to the early 1960s. Following Buzz Lightyear's disappearance, Nixon was the only politician determined to rescue his best friend, even if it was at the cost of America's economic status. This noble but misguided attempt to achieve this goal not only left a sour taste to the GOP, but to America as a whole. Nixon leaves office on August 8, 1974, and lived in isolation, severing all ties from those whom he thought were friends during his time of need, including Flan. Spyro's presence didn't do anything to change Nixon's mind, but following the success of Spyro and Flan's task in preventing a crystalline detonation, Nixon became more open to them and is willing to accept them. However, Godzilla and Misalika's interference in all this motivated the former president to join the fight, despite his old age. Richard becomes a space ranger and goes on a journey to the Genie Realm only to run into Etna's fleet and crash into Mystica. Throughout the story, Nixon reunites with Buzz and joins the heroes on a fight against Misalika and her human senator Joe Biden. He grows to care for those who have been fighting to save their homelands from a socialist dictatorship and won, but lamentation would arise as Buzz was rescued with his legs and chest crushed. This realization left Richard Nixon devastated and feeling responsible for not saving his old friend. With Lightyear being saved and transformed to the Master Chief Ranger, all Nixon asks Spyro and his allies is to care and love him, ensuring that his friend gets the life and family he deserved. With Velvet Crow already being accepted into the Purple Dragon's life, Spyro takes an oath to keep Buzz as one of his own. Before watching the video from the beginning, you were expecting me to make some extremist video about sympathizing Nixon for his Watergate scandal or any of that. No. This is to use some of this information to open up a slightly altered look in this timeline. So yes, Richard Nixon is still a crook. But he won't be a villain either. Next time, we'll discuss the kaiju aspect of the series, Rodan and King Ghidorah. From this point onward, later episodes will get slightly shorter, with some still being extensive. Thanks for watching, feel free to subscribe, and I'll catch you all next time. Over and out.